A question so powerful it left everyone in tears. The Shreveport, Louisiana Church Fellowship Hall was filled with the gentle hum of voices and the screeching of folding chairs on the shiny floor. This room, typically filled with laughter on Sunday potlucks and fiery debates on Bible study, had an otherworldly feel that night. Donald Trump sat at the head of the room, his presence unmistakable, his mannerisms familiar to all. Tonight, though, he was different. He was not the incendiary orator they had witnessed at rallies. He was tamped down, even contemplative, as if aware that tonight's gathering bore a weight more than politics. The crowd, comprised of families, retirees, and inquisitive locals, listened in stunned silence as Trump discussed policies, accomplishments, and the future of America. The room was filled with polite applause and the occasional nod of assent. But something was brewing beneath the surface, something no one expected, and then it did. In the crowd was a little girl who was noticed, not by size but by the intense silence in her eyes. An 8-year-old girl, Lily, in her Sunday best, held a tattered, aged Bible to her breast. It was no generic Bible. It was a family Bible, one left to her from her deceased grandmother, whose paper was delicate and whose golden ink was worn by age. Staring, she had been urged by her mother, "You can ask him, but just if you have the courage to do so, and only if you mean it." Lily had nodded, her heart racing. She had practiced her question for weeks, writing it in her notebook in school, repeating it under the covers at night. This was not an easy question. It was the question that had been etched into her little heart, a question too great for something so small, and tonight she would ask it. As night wore on, adults got up to take the microphone, questioning national policy, local concerns, even praising Trump on his red signature tie, the norm. Lily hesitated, leaning forward in her chair. Second-guessing set in. Should she indeed go through with this? Then her mother helped nudge her forward. This was her time. Her legs trembled as she stood. Her heart beat so hard that everyone in the room could hear it. The microphone was so far away, and yet, step by step, slowly, she started to move towards it. Person by person, people began to stare at her. A child, a little girl holding a Bible, alone. Whispers spread like fire, and then it was her turn. Trump gazed down at her. For an instant, his face altered, mellowed. Perhaps it was the fact that the Bible lay open before him. Perhaps it was the courage in her eyes, but something halted him in his tracks. And then she asked the question. Her voice shook, but did not crack. "Mr. Trump, what does God mean to you?" Silence. The whole room froze. Eyes flicked from Trump to the child. A question so innocent, so profound. And then what happened? Reduced everyone to tears. A moment that caught everyone off guard. The gravity of the question lingered in the atmosphere like a cloud, keeping everyone under its spell. For a man who was famous for providing quick-fire answers and oozing confidence, Donald Trump did not respond promptly. Rather, he glared at Lily, then at the worn-out Bible held by her tiny fingers. Something in his posture shifted. The silence grew thick in the air, prompting everyone to the edge of their seats. Trump's silence was truly deafening. For a man who had made an entire career out of snappy replies and loud proclamations, this silence was new, nervy even. He didn't reply. He merely glared at Lily, his typical bravado for a moment stripped away. And then something surprising occurred. His eyes refocused on the Bible, his mouth opened, but nothing emerged. Lily trembled under the burden of the moment. She looked small, almost fragile, and yet the unshakable force in her eyes never wavered. Her question was not a challenge or one of provocation. It wasn't a trap. It was a sincere one that sprang from a child's heart, wishing for something beyond itself. And somehow that unvarnished honesty resonated louder than any political speech or campaign slogan ever had. The room fell completely still. No one coughed, no chair creaked, no one whispered. It was like the very air itself was frozen in anticipation. Then Trump exhaled. Finally, he placed a hand forward slightly, almost as if he were steadying himself, and leaned on the podium. "That's a big question," he said. His voice was lower, calmer, missing its usual sharpness. and it's not one I've always had the answer to." The crowd stirred. This was different. This wasn't the irreproachable, self-confident Trump they were accustomed to viewing. This was something unexpected. He looked over his shoulder at Lily, his face changing again, this time to something nearly paternal. "When I was roughly your age," he went on, "I had a whole lot of questions about God myself. My parents brought me to church every Sunday. I remember sitting in those pews, looking up at the stained glass windows, wondering if God was even looking at me." He stopped. He wasn't acting for the first time that night. He wasn't giving a speech. He was remembering. His hand lay across the podium, fingers on wood, tapping softly as if pinning him down. "My father used to say to me," he continued, "that faith is a ladder. You ascend one step at a time, and occasionally you're sure you're going to fall, but you just keep climbing, because something's up there that's worth grasping for." He stopped once more. His gaze roved across the crowd, measuring the audience. At that point, I didn't understand what he was talking about. I was like, "Oh, all right," something he said to quiet me down. A small laugh went up from the audience, just releasing the temporary tension, but Lily smiled not. She glanced not aside. She just stood looking at him, waiting, because she knew this moment wasn't finished yet. A question that broke through the noise. Lily was still waiting. She didn't need a practiced speech or a scripted answer. She needed the truth, the one that couldn't be manipulated or perfected. Trump leaned in, his voice softening further. "As I grew up, life presented a lot of obstacles to me," he conceded. "I experienced losses, failures, moments when I didn't know if I could continue. And in those moments, I didn't always sense God was with me." The room was in complete silence. Not the usual practiced oratory they were accustomed to hearing, not politics, something actual, something honest. "Sometimes I was mad at him," Trump went on. "Other times I thought perhaps he'd abandoned me completely." No boastfulness now in his voice, no political slogans, only candor, and then his voice soothing. "But I'll tell you this," he said, standing a little taller. "Even when I was at my worst, when I believed I was the only one, I did know something. Faith is not knowing everything. It's believing that even when you can't see the big picture, something's going on. There's something bigger at work." He looked over at Lily again. Her hold on the Bible had relaxed somewhat, and her big eyes shone with light under the fluorescent light. And then, in a slow, deliberate tone, he spoke. "And God, to me, is that purpose. He's the reminder that even when we fail, even when we stumble, we're not finished. He's the one who continues to urge us to ascend the ladder, even when it's going to shatter." The room breathed out. But before the force of his words could truly take hold, something else occurred. Lily's eyes filled with tears. The crowd hissed, knowing they were seeing something special. A lone tear started, moving gently down her face. Then, as Trump concluded speaking, her shoulders shook. The desperate whispers among the crowd escalated, yet no one was brave enough to intervene. Her mother automatically stooped to put a gentle hand on her back. "It's okay, baby," she whispered. Lily shook her head. Not sorrow, something else. Trump had said things she'd never realized she'd ever needed to hear, and in saying so, he'd reached a part of her heart she'd sealed off so many years before. He'd seen her. Moving back from the microphone, he loomed over her, his normal, powerful presence now searingly gentle. "What is your name?" he asked. Lily stumbled. "Lily," she breathed, the words almost inaudible. A small smile spread across his lips. "That's a beautiful name." Then, after a moment's hesitation, he continued, "You know, Lily, sometimes the most obvious questions are the most difficult to answer, and sometimes those questions remind us of what truly matters." Lily nodded, her tears welling up but never once escaping his gaze. "My grandma used to say that too," she whispered. "She said God is always listening, even when you don't hear him." Trump's face flickered, a brief flash of something unsaid, a combination of awe, comprehension, perhaps even acknowledgement. He paused and faced the audience once more. "You know," he said, his eyes sweeping the room. This little girl posed a question that most adults are too cowardly to ask. A silence fell on the crowd once more. What does God mean to us? He went on. It's not a simple one, because it forces us to look inward. It forces us to confront our fears, our doubts, and our shortcomings. The force of his words hung there, and for an instant, just an instant, it seemed like Lily was more than a little girl holding a Bible. She was a reflection, reflecting something more than anyone in that room could have imagined. And in the quiet, in that unspoken consensus, the resolution she had so long been looking for had finally been reached. More than just a question, a moment that changed everything. She wasn't anymore the little girl gripping a Bible. Lily stood for something greater in that one instant. Her bravery had done something that no political speech ever could have, had turned the whole feel of the night around. What had started as a standard town hall meeting had turned into a passionate, personal examination of religion, mission, and humanity. And Trump was feeling it too. His tone, still strong, was now gentler. We exist in a world where we're constantly seeking answers outside of ourselves, he told them. We believe power, success, or wealth will fill the void, but they don't. He let the truth land on the group before speaking. The answers that truly count are the uncomfortable ones, the ones that leave us introspecting. What do I care about? What am I for? And who am I when no one's looking? The pause that dragged on, endless. And then Trump, glancing at Lily again, with a mask over his features. Appreciate that, Lily, he said. You're smarter than most grown-ups I know. A ripple of soft applause went through the crowd. But Lily? She didn't even seem to notice. Her sobbing had ceased. Instead, a soft pride glowed in her eyes. She dried her wet cheeks on the arm of her dress and looked up at her mother. Their eyes met, one full of youthful conviction, the other full of gentle admiration. Her mother smiled through her own tears of shining happiness, but this moment wasn't quite over yet. The applause faded, and then a shift, a slight change in Trump's face, a burden, heavier than politics, heavier than public life. And when he spoke once more, his voice held something irrevocably personal. There was a moment in my life, he started slowly, when I thought I had it all figured out. He adjusted himself at the podium, looking around the room. The air itself stretched, as if holding its breath for what he would speak. I had drive, plans, ambition, but there was one moment, just one, that made me see how little control I really had. The crowd leaned in. This wasn't another speech. This was something else, something real. My brother Fred, he said at last. His voice, for the first time that night, trembled, just a little. He was one of the kindest, most honest men I ever knew. He had a glow about him, a goodness which I did not fully realize then. A pause, the sort that speaks 1,000 unspoken words. But Fred battled. Trump exhaled. He had his devils, and whatever my family and I did to try and help him, it wasn't sufficient. Silence. Not the sort born of distraction, but the sort that fills a room and won't let up. And then, Trump went on, a moment of reckoning and an unexpected question. Trump's voice cracked temporarily. Then he cleared his throat, composing himself. When he died, I was angry. His hand clenched the podium tighter. Angry at him, angry at me, angry at God. The room was stone silent. Even Lily, being so young, seemed to understand the importance of what he was telling her. I didn't know, he went on, why this good woman, a woman with so much to live for, would have to leave us all so abruptly. For years afterward, I turned on God. I thought, if he is, why would he do that? Why would he take a person like Fred, and not me? A deep breath. His fingers drummed restlessly on the podium. But then things changed. Trump's tone grew softer, as if he were speaking to himself as much as to the audience. I don't know whether it was a dream or a memory, but I did see Fred's face one night in my head. He hesitated. He was smiling, that big, goofy smile he always employed, and I heard him say to me, "Don't be angry, Don. You have work to do." The audience gasped in silence all at once. Even the distant hum of cars outside seemed to disappear. It was just Trump, his voice, and the collective pulse of the room. I knew then, that faith is not about knowing everything. His voice relaxed. It's about having faith there's a reason. no matter when you can't see it. And maybe, possibly, Fred's lesson was to learn how to do that. A slow, heavy silence sat, and then Trump turned to Lily again, his face softer than previously. So, if you're curious about what God means to me, I'll tell you this. He looked at her. He's what makes me get out of bed every morning, even when it gets difficult. He's the reminder that we're here for someone other than ourselves, and he's the one who provides hope, even at the worst hour. Lily's vision blurred, but no tears fell this time. She stood a bit taller instead. Her hold on her grandmother's Bible became harder, as if she had merely discovered something immeasurable inside of herself. The room leaned forward under the burden of what had just been spoken, until someone indicated. A ripple of movement broke the stillness. The audience turned toward the back of the hall, where a man, broad-shouldered, weathered, serious, stood slowly. He looked like someone you'd pass on the street without a second thought. Maybe a mechanic, maybe a father, maybe someone who attended church only when life allowed. His voice, however, cut through the silence like a dawn bell. "Mr. Trump," he stated, his tone measured, "I've devoted years to attempting to get my own religion worked out. To hear you discuss it this way, anger, doubt, and hope, leaves me to wonder." He hesitated, looking around as if in search of the proper words. "It makes me wonder that maybe all of us have been too scared to admit we're struggling." There was silence. Then, "Do you think that's part of the problem?" Trump blinked in surprise. For the first time that evening, he had no instant comeback. Then, hesitantly, he leaned back against the podium, his eyes locked with the man's. And when at last he finally did speak, his response was one no one was expecting. Faith, doubt, and the strength we hide. Trump drew in a deep breath, his eyes unyielding. "We're not as strong as we want people to believe that we are." The words lingered. "Faith isn't easy, it's complicated, it's messy, and sometimes it feels like you're just shouting into the void." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Heads nodded in unison, eyes gentled. Even the man who'd posed the question breathed deeply, his shoulders relaxing as he sat back in his chair. But then, a tiny voice interrupted the quiet. "My grandma used to say, faith is like planting seeds." Lily, her voice, firm and clear for such a small body. "You don't always see them grow right away, but you have to believe they will." Trump smiled, not his practiced, perfect smile. Something genuine, software almost tender. "Your grandma sounds like a very wise woman," he said, his voice low and soothing. "And she's right." A moment, then, faith is a seed. It doesn't always grow the way you want it to, but that doesn't mean it's not there, growing out of sight. The room hung in the air. People shifted, looked at each other, breathed softly to the person next to them. This was no longer a town hall. This was something more, something deep. A moment of collective contemplation on doubts, struggles, and the quiet moments of grace that define us. Then, a woman in the third row raised her hand, her silver hair tightly pulled back, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I lost my husband last year," she said, her voice shaking. "I've been angry at God ever since." A pause. "I feel like I've lost my faith altogether." Her voice broke. "Do you think it's too late to regain it?" Trump leaned forward. His voice was soft but authoritative. "It's never too late." Another pause. Then, "Faith isn't something you lose forever. It's something that waits for you. And sometimes, at the most silent of times, when you don't expect it, it comes back to you." The woman nodded. A single tear slid down her face. Others in the room sniffled and blotted their noses with tissues. Some simply sat, silent, contemplative. But something had changed. This was no longer politics. This was about a connection, and what came next would only serve to make that bond more unbreakable. A town hall transformed something entirely different. The atmosphere was charged now, not with commotion, but with a collective resonance of openness. Individuals who had arrived anticipating a political speech were instead being led through something deeply personal. It was as if Lily's small question had unlocked a door no one had ever found the courage to even approach. And now, no one desired to turn back. Trump stood tall. He looked out around the room at the faces of the people he was with. Then, "You know, there's something I've learned over the years. A pause. Faith doesn't always show up in grand moments. His voice was softer now. It's in the small ones. A murmur of agreement. He continued, it's in the moments when someone lends a hand, when someone listens while you're hurting, or when someone asks a question as brave as Lily's. A look in the direction of the little girl, who sat a bit taller now. Those moments, Trump declared, his tone steady, remind us of what truly matters. For a moment long, no one spoke. Then, soft clapping, not wild clapping, not hollow clapping, something quieter, more intimate, as if every person there had just felt something shift inside themselves. Trump looked at Lily again. A small smile still flickered on her lips. Her mother stepped forward, whispering something, and whatever it was, it spread Lily's smile wider. Faith, division, and the power to come together. Trump's voice grew firmer. We're living in a time when it feels like the world is pulling us apart. He scanned the room, letting the weight of his words settle. Politics, opinions, differences. A pause, then. But faith, he leaned in slightly. Faith has the power to bring us together. A murmur rippled through the crowd. It's not about being the same. It's about understanding that we're all climbing the same ladder, one step at a time, no matter how different our paths look. A slow ripple of applause began. Soft at first, then growing. People stood, clapping, not just for Trump, but for the moment itself, for the courage it had taken Lily to ask her question, for the honesty it had pulled out of everyone in the room, for the connection they hadn't expected, but now couldn't ignore. As the applause faded, Trump leaned forward once more, his voice booming out with conviction. So tonight, I'll leave you with this. It was strong, but there was something irrepressibly raw about it now. Ask yourselves what faith means to you. And don't be afraid of the answer, no matter how unsure it may be. He stood still, allowing the silence to build. Then, because faith isn't about knowing, it's about believing. Another pause for a moment, then softer, and if you found something tonight that touched you, hold on to it, let it grow, and share it with the people who need it most. The room exploded. Applause, yes, but more than that. Hugs, handshakes, tears. Strangers who had come with nothing but courteous nods now lingered behind, swapping stories, smiles, and something that seemed unspoken. A moment that wouldn't be forgotten. Lily, now at her mother's side, observed as Trump stepped away from the microphone. Then, to her surprise, he walked right up to her and knelt down so they were eye to eye. "Thank you, Lily." His voice was low, but sincere. "You've got more courage than most people twice your age. Don't ever lose that." She nodded. Then, with the quiet confidence of someone who had found her voice, she extended her small hand. Trump took it. "Thank you, Mr. Trump," she said, her voice steady now, "for answering." He grinned weakly, then rose, glancing over the crowd once more for one last wave before leaving. But the evening was not yet over. The room was still lively, humming with chatter. Folks weren't yet ready to call it a night. They came to hear a speech. They had gotten something different. The lasting legacy. Lily regarded her mother. Her voice was gentle, but firm. "Grandma would have been proud, wouldn't she?" Her mother smiled, tears shining. "More than proud, sweetie." A hesitation. "She would have been astounded." And as the hall gradually cleared, as strangers shared a final hug, a final handshake, the lingering message was unmistakable. Sometimes the most courageous questions have the most surprising answers. And in those answers, we discover the fragments of ourselves we never even knew were lost. If this story touched you, take a few minutes today to examine your own faith. And if you know someone who could benefit from hearing this message, share it, because you never know whose heart is open to the right words. And if you need more stories to inspire, to stir, to bring us together,